Greetings, Neil Whitman here, old soldier, new pastor. What I want to talk about today is how do we answer this question, which I have heard a number of times, and that is how can I incorporate spirituality and believe in it? Right? Because fundamentally, the problem that a lot of people are having is even if they recognize that they need something outside of themselves or something bigger, that they need spirituality, they have a hard time doing that because, in a very real way, they just don't believe that it's real. Now, it is an interesting problem, and don't just look at this as, Neil, the pastor of a Christian church, saying, hey, you need to get into church. The reality is that this is something which even secular psychologists have begun to realize is a very core part of the human experience which we need to incorporate into ourselves for mental well-being. I could point you, for example, to our very secular Canadian government's publications through this Mission Ready, which came out a number of years ago to the Canadian Armed Forces, and it talks about 6 spheres of mental well-being. And the 6 spheres of kind of the whole person are my career, my family, my health, my relationships, my beliefs, and my finances. Okay? Now, that's an interesting thing because you wouldn't have seen that some years ago. I think that there has been a kind of growing realization, even amongst secular psychology, that we have a problem in the West where, having kind of abandoned religion in the main in our culture, there is a necessary human experience that they might consider to just be an evolutionary hangover, but nevertheless something which is necessary for you to have good mental health, which is lacking in most people's lives. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? I mean, the road from rationalism's birth to now has been a long one, and the fruits of it are certainly something you could spend a lot of time looking at. We won't do that here during this video, but you have a situation now which I think has really come to the fore because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and having folks from the US, Canada, and Britain, among other nations from the West, who have experienced mental, emotional, and moral trauma in a huge way in numbers that haven't been seen in our secularized society for, well, ever, actually. So you certainly could look back to Vietnam and say, well, it was then. But yes, it was then. But even in the 60s and 70s, spirituality was something which was just embedded in the idea and the minds of everybody. Even if you look at the hard rock bands, the rebels of that age, their music was steeped in spiritual language. So spirituality was a part of the human experience, even outside of the church to some extent. There was a recognition of this as part of your life. But in recent years, we have really affected the divorce. I think for the first time in Western history, we've en masse affected the divorce between man and spirituality. And so, if, like me, you grew up in Canada, and I suspect most parts of the United States, barring a few of the more conservative states, since the 80s, you will have been taught in school that religion was fine if you had to do it, but it was probably presented to you as kind of the root of all the world's problems, um, which, we could talk about that at length in some other context as well. It's not entirely untrue, for one thing, but neither has the absence of religion been better. In fact, one might argue, I think quite credibly, it's been a lot worse in the countries that have, got rid of the opiate of the masses. Nevertheless, that argument left aside, we've been taught not to trust religion, and then we've been taught that you can only trust those things which are scientifically verifiable and material. And this is the idea that is materialism, and we've all incorporated this into ourselves. And I speak even to those who are practicing a faith, practicing Christianity, that you will, if you explore yourself, I think, find that this ideology has probably deeply impacted you if you are 40 or younger in North America or any Western country, I suspect. So you've got this idea of not being able to trust anything you can't scientifically, quantifiably verify. And then you've got these folks saying, well, you actually need to start incorporating a belief system into your life or you will not be mentally well. But I can't believe things because my whole understanding of what I can believe is that the only thing I can believe is science, right? And I might play at going to religion because, there's ritual and maybe that's good and calming. And, I might go to meditation or pursue some kind of, very popular and increasingly popular to be engaged in pagan religion, the old classic religions like Wodenism and even neo-paganism of the Latin kind is kind of having its resurgence. But to actually believe in something is very, very impossible in some cases. Like you can't make yourself believe. Uh, well, how do you deal with that thing? How do you try to incorporate this into your life, which is something that even the secular psychologists are saying you need uh, if you can't approach it? And I would put to you that the answer to your question is is fundamentally found in something Jesus said, which is that uh, if you would enter the kingdom of heaven, you must do so like a child. Now, bear with me here for a second. If you're terrified of biblical verses here, listen to what I'm saying here. If you would enter the kingdom of heaven, said Jesus, you must enter it like a child. Now, the context in which he said that, according to uh, the Gospels, is that the disciples were there, and these are the guys who are, kind of expecting at that time that there's going to be a physical kingdom that Jesus is going to establish in Jerusalem. He's going to destroy the Romans, and the Jews are going to take over the world, right? And they're very, they're not learned men because they're fishermen and whatnot, but they have kind of a high view of themselves. It comes out quite a bit in that text. And these kids are coming to Jesus for blessing, and they are trying to shoo them off. And Jesus says, look, stop. Stop what you're doing. You understand, don't hinder these kids from coming to me because it is children like this who will enter the kingdom, who will receive the kingdom of heaven. And I tell you, even that you must become like them if you want to get into the kingdom of heaven. Now, you might say, well, what's all this Christian nonsense mumbo jumbo that this guy's spouting out? Well, think about this, okay? So, I have so often heard the argument that if I say something to the effect that, there are higher truths than simply this material world, there is this idea of love, for example. You can't measure love, you can't quantify love. It's an experience, you could talk about dopamine levels in the brain, but that isn't love. It might happen when you're in love. You could make an argument, which I think is false, that because it's way oversimplistic, that it causes love, because You don't just cause that to happen. It's part of being in a hugely complex system, which is our physical world and interacting with other uh, entities that have agency, other people. And so it's a thing that happens. It's not just pheromones. It's not just chemicals. There's interplay and there's interaction, and it's a result of things. But it's experientially, it's a real thing that you can talk about, you can describe, and everybody can relate to it, right? So it's a common, real experience, and it's not something scientific. I could talk about evil, and we all have an experience of evil. You might not use that term for it, but things which you find deeply wrong, things that people do to others that are something you perceive in a real way as being deeply wrong. And, I talk about something like that, and someone might say, often they do say, well, that's just your subjective morality. And I feel what you're saying, but that's only because I was raised in this Judeo Christian culture. It's not real, it's only the function of my upbringing. Okay, so what I want to tell you, and this is fundamentally important, it ties back to what I was just saying, but bear with me. The fact that you can even say that love is a subjective experience is a product of your upbringing, right? That is not a natural idea. This is not the idea that a child has when he experiences love or happiness or sadness or injustice, okay? They don't measure it and quantify it and talk about subjective experience. It's not a natural human experience for a grown up who grows up in a culture that does not train them to try and scientifically quantify everything. That is a learned behavior. So if you want to harp about Judeo Christian values and how you have these nurtured ideas and there is no real evil, you only think there's evil because you were trained to believe that there's evil. Man, you only think that you can question evil because you were trained to think that you can question evil. Okay? You bearing with me? So the fundamental problem here, folks, is that when you approach higher truths that you actually perceive, you do, and you dissect them and tear them apart, it is not because they aren't real. It's because you are trying to use the wrong tool to access something that is, it's like you've got your Phillips screwdriver, right, with the star head, and you're trying to use it to take the bolts off of the car wheel, right? This isn't a tool that's even designed to interface with that piece of equipment. It's a different thing. And so when you try to apply scientific measurements to felt human experiences and higher truths, you can't, right? And you shouldn't. Like, it's actually not even sensible that you would question that love is a real thing. This is a learned experience. So I want to just try and use something of an analogy uh, to try and help you appreciate what I'm trying to say here. Is so a materialist way of looking at the world is basically to dissect the experience into all of its component parts and measure them and weigh them. Now, as an analogy, and if anyone is here listening that listens to my sermons, I did recently use this analogy, so I'm reusing it here. As an analogy, my daughter recently got a dogfish. She got a dogfish to dissect for her science class. And so she gets her book out, right? And she gets her little probe and her scalpel. She cuts the fish open and she, opens the guts and slowly gets each one of carefully removing the organs of this dogfish, this formaldehyde steeped dogfish, and she labels each organ and she writes it in her book, all of her observations, and that's good. That's good science. That's biology. You're looking at all of the component parts of a dogfish. Now, that's fine and that's important. And there's some crazy idea out there that somehow uh, spirituality or Christianity can't function alongside science. Like these two things are opposed. They're not. They're like they don't even hit each other. They're on different planes here because science is dissecting the dogfish and looking at all of its component parts and understanding the way that each one of these organs functions and what it does in the body, and that's great. You can do that, and you will still not have understood the dogfish, right? Because you can't simply break it down into its component parts and pretend that you have understood what it is, right? You could take that to an absurd level and you could kiln dry it and break it down into dust and then separate out each of its elemental components and weigh it as so many parts carbon, so many parts nitrogen, so many parts oxygen, etc., 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 and put it in jars and say, look at all these jars. I now have the dogfish. I understand what it is. It's so much this, so much that. Like, okay. But here's the thing. So why do people have throughout history fish ponds? Why the classic koi pond in Japan to have these fish swimming about so you can sit and watch them? Because fish are grace. Think about that for a second. Right? Fish are grace. If you look at the dogfish in its natural habitat and you watch the wonder of a dogfish school that is corralling and going in gracefully like this three-dimensional ballet to scoop up little fish that are its predators. And yeah, I know some dogfish are bottom feeders, but uh, they are a shark. Um, so that ballet is beautiful. You can try and dissect how that happens, and you can cut it all apart, and you can totally destroy what is the fundamental experience of watching that, which is beauty and grace. You see, beauty is something you recognize. You can find it in music, right? Like, what is music? Music is it is an emotional experience that somehow comes from noises that are structured properly, and you can change people's emotions with different music being played. And we know this, right? Like, obviously, we incorporate that into so much of our entertainment. Uh, every movie has a score that leads your emotions, and what is that, right? We actually do automatically recognize something that is not music, which is notes played discordantly. And so there's some order there that is being kind of drawn or funneled, some higher order that's being funneled through the composer onto the page and expressed, and we receive it and it has its effect in us. And it's, of course, it's one of the great things for which there is really no evolutionary explanation for that, right? There's something else being tapped into there. Beauty, it's a felt thing. It's not a thing that you tear apart, dissect, and lay on the table like a cold dead fish. It's a thing that you surrender to and let it fill you and experience it. And so it is when you want to experience and approach spirituality. Now, the problem for a lot of people that I want to address here is I would suspect that any number of listeners who aren't already looking at this from a Christian framework, they, even if they are curious and interested in trying to find some way of incorporating spirituality into their life, they do not perceive Christianity as that thing, because Christianity is the old, archaic monster religion that enslaved us for all those years. Well, what can I say to that? Christ is not the church, right? The church is the bride of Christ, the Bible says, like so on and so forth. Um, but what you think of as the church isn't even the church. The church is not every religious thing that called itself Christianity. The church is made up of people who have truly surrendered to God and felt a oneness with Him. And Christianity is spirituality. I would argue that it is the best and only way to truly experience spirituality on the level that you need to, because it is a unique thing. You see, Christianity isn't rules. Spirituality through Christianity isn't rules. In fact, the book even says that it's not about the rules. The rules are only there to show you how much you need God, because the rules show you that you can't keep the rules, and thus force you to turn to God and seek to have a relationship with Him as a supplicant, one who comes with nothing, one who comes not to use God, but one who comes to actually be used by God. And this is the fundamental difference. You see, we talk about the music, and the music is something you have to let use your emotions. You have to let it in. You have to surrender to it. When you analyze it, you destroy it, right? And if you want to approach Christianity and actually let it do its work in you, you can't be one who looks at it and says, this book, Jordan Peterson talks about this book as, probably the best expression of the human experience. And let's analyze it and take all of the symbols out of it and try and employ these symbols in our lives in a way that will help us to grow and understand ourselves better. Well, that's fine because it does that. But you can't actually use God for yourself, right? God is there, and if you want to be in touch with Him, you have to be willing to be used by Him. You have to let Him infuse you like the music, and you have to surrender. And it all comes back to this thing that if you're trying to analyze this, understand it, if you need to completely grasp what it is before you accept it, you never will, right? Because it defies you to do that. A child looks at a tree and it's a tree. A child looks at a tree and sees waves of leaves blowing in the wind and maybe a neat place to climb and have an adventure, and he definitely doesn't look at that tree and see it as a thing with rigid cell walls of plant nature in biology and start, taxonomically describing it. He doesn't look at the leaves and the majestic tree that rises up into the heavens above him and say, ah, yes, the way that happens is that you've got these chlorophyll structures in the leaves that capture photons and use a complex multi-stage process to convert that energy from the capture into the construction of sugar, which it uses to build more of itself. And, thus all life on Earth has its kind of origin in plant nature, and I have understood trees. Yeah, well, no, you haven't. If you can't recapture what it's like to look at a tree and just glory in its splendor, then you haven't really understood that tree. And if you can't look at God and just glory in a creator who deigns to even bother to pay attention to you, if you can't approach this as a thing to surrender to and be used by and built up by and just changed by in a glorious and good way, then it will never work for you. So, it's a rant, guys. That's my rant. If you want to incorporate spirituality into your experience, uh, it won't happen until you come at it humbly and let it teach you and change you and be what a child is when you come to it. Be as one who is willing to accept things that you can't quantify as real. Be willing to approach it as one who is ready to let those things have their real effect on you. And, you know, I can't, in this little conversation, explain the wholeness of this, but I can say this. Jesus Christ, this idea that is Jesus Christ, is in fact the real God. Okay? Like, you have Jordan Peterson up on the stage and Sam Harris up on the stage, and Sam's like, "Did Jesus rise from the dead?" And Jordan Peterson's like, "I couldn't answer that in 40 hours." And Sam Harris is like, "Almost certainly not. Why won't you just say it?" Right? Well, yes, he did. And it was witnessed by hundreds of people, and they believed in it, and it changed them, and it allowed them to become people who conquered the Roman Empire without ever committing an act of violence to do it. That only by their changed lives did they spread this complete antithetical idea of the slave who was God and have that proclaimed among all the nations of the world. It is an incredible thing. And it's real. And if you want to have the benefit of real spirituality, then you need to approach it as one humble enough to actually speak to God as though he was really God, and not just approach it as a ritual you can use to help yourself. And you need to approach it as one who knows that you don't have the answers, and not pretend to be somebody who thinks you can gain them through your own wisdom. It's simple. It's just hard because you have to actually give up your own godness in your own life. You cannot do this by being the ruler of yourself. You have to do it by being one who submits to the rulership of a higher power. Peace.